abide by, certainly here on this side of the aisle, and that is no taxation without representation. That is essentially the function of Parliament at this point in time, right? If we are going to tax the people that we represent, then we are accountable to them for how we spend their money. We should be able to explain what sort of impact spending and collecting revenue from them and then spending it will have on their lives. The situation that's at the core of this motion today is that the government has implemented a very punitive tax on Canadians and is taxing them without information. So we have taxation without information. Let me give you exactly what I'm talking about. There was a departmental note that was written entitled Impact of a Carbon Price on Households' Consumption Costs Across Income Distribution. This was presented to the Liberal government after the election. We, as the Conservative Party of Canada, asked for a copy of this document because ostensibly it's what the government's carbon tax is predicated on. So again, the government made a decision to impose a tax on Canadians. This is the information that they provided, that they were making that on, what the cost would be to average households, and then we should be able, as the opposition, to have that information so that we can represent our constituents to see whether or not this policy instrument, A, will work, and what the opportunity cost, or the cost of taking that money from Canadians through their tax, will be. What's their return on investment for seeing the cost of goods increase? Now, that document, Mr. Speaker, when we got it, and I think I'll post this to my website or my Facebook page later today, it was completely redacted. So it essentially says the cost to Canadian households will be giant redacted table. It's just completely blacked out. And that's the core of the motion today. In order for the House to be able to represent the people that we represent, that elected us, that gave us a mandate to be here, and to decide whether or not this tax is actually in the best interest of Canadians, we should know the government's modeling that they use to determine whether or not this tax should be implemented. Now, my sense, based on what I've seen, external economists outside of the public service have certainly said that the carbon tax is going to raise the cost of goods on everything. Now think about this. Canada is a very large country. It's geographically diverse. We have to travel long distances to get from one place or another. I'm just even thinking about all the people in this place that have to commute back and forth from their ridings just to get to Parliament. Never mind the fact that we are agriculturally intensive and that a large portion of our economy is based on natural resource extraction. All of those things use what as an input? Carbon. Now, if you start pushing that down to the household level, I could spend a whole day just talking about the impact on industry and loss of jobs. But that tax, because we have to fill up our cars, because it's cold here and we have to heat our homes, that tax is going to increase the cost to the average Canadian household, right? Anybody here who is seeing the price of gas these days and makes that sort of puckering sound or shiver when they put that gas in their car understands that this carbon tax is impacting them. Now, one of my colleagues, Mr. Speaker, got up and waxed eloquently about economics, about supply and demand. And he argued that if you put a tax on something, that people's demand for it will decrease. So what he was arguing was that the carbon tax that the Liberals have put in place will actually decrease the demand for Canadians for things like gas, heating, farm implements. Now, here's the problem. The other piece of information that they have that they won't release is the assumptions on how much demand will decrease. How much will this carbon tax actually reduce demand? They're not releasing that. So we have a double problem here. Anybody who is making that cringy sort of face, filling up their tank right now, is still doing what? Filling up their tank. Why? Because we're Canada. We have to drive places to go places. So the demand is not going to decrease at the price that the Liberals have put in place, but it's going to increase the cost of living for average Canadians. And that is the reason why this government will not release this information, is they don't want taxation with information. They do not want taxation with representation. And why? Because they have a dogmatic, almost religious zealotry adherence to this carbon tax that they put in place. And why? Again, because they have spent so out of control. Their deficit budget is so unimaginably high that they are looking at every possible option to squeeze average Canadians for their poor financial management. And it is my job and the job of everyone else sitting on this side of the House to say, no, it stops here. We need this information. Canadians need this information because this government did not receive a mandate to be completely disrespectful of the hard-earned money that Canadians toil every day for. Exactly. And we also understand that that information needs to be used to look at lower-income Canadians. We know that taxes like this have a higher disproportionate cost to someone who is making less money. Because they make a lower income and they still have the same input costs on things like transit passes, food, driving around, that tax has a higher input on people like single moms and senior women. And that's wrong. That's also our job here. That is why we need this information. And that is why we are prepared to make this government sit here for 24 hours over and over again until they allow taxation with information, not blocks of redacted information. That's ridiculous, Mr. Speaker. Now, Mr. Speaker, the Minister of the Environment, the religious, dogmatic climate change spokesperson-in-chief in this House of Commons, stood up today and with great zeal said, I tabled a document on April 30th, and it shall set you free. Except there's absolutely nothing in her document. You can look through it. You can go on her website. There is nothing in there that speaks to the cost of household of Canadians. And why? Because this is how this government operates. They do not want Canadians looking at their books. And why? Because it's a burning dumpster fire that is adding carbon to our environment, Mr. Speaker. I have to tell you, if we are going to put a consumption tax that is going to increase the cost of everything to Canadians, anybody who is filling up their tank right now, Mr. Speaker, understands what this carbon tax is going to do for them. It better, one, work, which it doesn't, and two, Canadians better buy into it, which they do not. The other thing is, this government is going to have to account for the fact that they are going to have legal challenges from virtually every province in this country saying, no, a provincial government is going to stand in the way of this carbon tax. And I'm so pleased to see Ontarians and soon-to-be Albertans rejecting another barrier to doing business. And let's talk about trade in closing. This government should have been making Canada more competitive, knowing the volatility of the American administration going into NAFTA talks. And what did they do? They put a cash grab in place, making it even more uncertain for investment, even more lost jobs, Mr. Speaker. I want that information. Every single Canadian has a right to know what was in that document. They have a right to know how much this tax is going to impact them. Because if we don't do that, if we don't have taxation with representation, then why do any of us have jobs? That government shouldn't.
Questions and comments. Questions et commentaires. The honourable member for Winnipeg North.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And, you know, the redacted information that the member across the way is asking about, the member should be aware, while she was in Cabinet, that the Conservatives actually had the information. I don't know if they didn't read it or if they're intentionally trying to mislead the House, Mr. Speaker. And then we have a document that was tabled by the minister today that was released well over a month ago, Mr. Speaker. The information is there if they're prepared to look. In regards to the specifics, then 80+% of Canadians already pay a price on pollution. The Conservatives know that, Mr. Speaker. Now, she uses the example, and this is what my question's on. Well, what about those on transit or those that are disadvantaged? If a province says that we are going to provide a subsidy, and a good example is our home province of Manitoba, where the Conservative government cut back on Winnipeg Transit transfer monies. If they reinstate that transit money, that means the city won't have to increase the cost of fares. By keeping those fares down, more people are able to afford the fares. It's up to the provinces. Many of the answers that the members across the way want, they need to go to the provinces. Maybe run as MLAs or MPPs. They might be able to get those specific answers.
The honourable member for Calgary Nose Hill.
First of all, my government didn't impose a carbon tax, a tax on everything. In fact, we stood against it. Proudly stand against it, and my leader has stood up and said, guess what? A Conservative government doesn't want to raise taxes on Canadians. We want to have them have more money in their pockets so that they can make choices. Government does not know how to spend people's money best. They do. That is the difference between the Conservatives and the Liberals. And let's talk about the Liberals' spending priority. We walked by every day. $8 million spent on a hockey rink that was used for about 4 or 5 months. How many bus passes would that have paid for in Winnipeg, Mr. Speaker? Rubber ducks all over the place. $200 million to facilitate work permits for people illegally crossing the border from the U.S. into Canada. $1 million for office renovations. Limo rides. That's the priorities of this government. And when they stand up and talk about fiscal prudence, I feel like vomiting, Mr. Speaker. I am so excited for Canadians to reject this ideology, bring Canada back to balance, bring Canada back to prosperity, and just have enough of these talking points and obfuscations. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Courtenay Alberni.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank my colleague for her passionate speech. Certainly, one thing I'm not hearing enough about today is the cost to taxpayers when it comes to natural disaster that are a result of climate change. We've seen record amounts of forest fires. We've seen floods like we've never seen before that are costing, the PBO is projecting about $5 billion a year by 2020 and greater. We've seen years even worse than that recently. We know that municipalities are trying to brace themselves in building infrastructure or preparing for more forest fires coming down the pipe. But we're not hearing the sense of urgency from the Conservatives or how they're going to deal with these issues, how they're going to protect middle-class Canadians, because, of course, this tax and being tax prudent is protecting taxpayers because they're the ones who are going to pick up the tab for these disasters and what we're seeing. We've seen solutions. We've seen countries like Sweden where they've lowered emissions by 25% through carbon tax initiatives, and they've grown their GDP by 69%, all since 1990. We've gone the other direction, Mr. Speaker. So I'd like to hear more about the answers and about tax prudence in terms of the impacts of climate change on taxpayers.
The honourable member for Calgary Nose Hill.
I'm sitting here with the member from High River who, Foothills. Sorry, John. Who suffered, in my riding at the time as well, we suffered a devastating flood in 2013 in Alberta. And my colleague and I often talk about this simple question with this point, when this point comes up. How much tax does somebody in my colleague's riding have to pay for his riding not to flood again? That's what the argument is that if you pay a certain amount of tax, changes the weather. It's going to change a flood. Now, I think that is completely ludicrous, especially when the tax is not going to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. What this government should be doing is, instead of spending $8 million on a hockey rink, $200 million on work permits for illegal border crossers, they should be trying to balance the budget and invest in flood mitigation infrastructure. Have we heard anything about that? No, because the infrastructure minister is focused on renovating his office. $1 million for that. That's right. I cannot believe these arguments around that if you're going to tax something, it's going to prevent a forest fire. That's bananas. We need things that actually work. Investments in actual infrastructure in the context of the balanced budget. I'm done with this rhetoric.
Resuming debate, the honourable member for Edmonton Strathcona.
Thank you.